Indian Warriors, the untold story of the Civil War on the History Channel. June 23rd, 1865. Nearly 3 months have passed since the fall of Petersburg, when the last of the Virginia blockades was broken and the Confederate capital in Richmond was finally breached. It has been more than 2 months since the commanders of the two weary armies met to sign the terms of surrender at the nearby outpost of Appomattox. But for some, the war is not yet over. One last act has yet to be played out. At a prearranged spot not far from Fort Towson, in what is now Oklahoma, an aging man in battle-worn clothes appears. He is Stand Watie, a brilliant Cherokee leader and tactician, the highest-ranking Native American in the Confederate Army, and the last Confederate general to surrender. He will do so under his own terms. The path that led him to this moment began not with the rift between North and South, but with a fracture within his own people. The breaking point came 3 decades before, over a policy by the American government known as Indian removal.
It would be as though someone would simply show up at your home and say, we're going to take you 2,000 miles away and leave everything that you know and everything you are familiar with behind.
The destination the government set aside for this purpose was called Indian Territory, some 70,000 square miles bordered by Texas on the south and Kansas on the north, comprising most of what is now Oklahoma. Here, the government built a series of forts largely to keep peace among the tribes forced to live in close proximity.
The government, I expect, thought that one Indian could get along with the next Indian. But it would be like somebody putting somebody in your house and saying you're going to share this house with them, and they're surprised when there's fighting. Who's going to get the master bedroom? Who's going to get the shower? You know, those kind of things.
In the Civil War to come, the Indian Territory will be used as a buffer zone between North and South. But from the start, there are conflicts within its borders that will erupt once again with the coming of the war. Some of the bloodiest were between members of the same tribe, the Cherokees of southeastern Tennessee and northern Georgia.
As a Cherokee citizen, I can speak very pointedly to the Cherokee removal. It meant internal division. It meant civil war inside of the Cherokee Nation.
In 1835, faced with growing pressure for removal, the Cherokees split into 2 groups, factions which will impact the outcome of the Civil War some 3 decades later. One side, headed by John Ross, the principal chief of the Cherokee, refused to relocate. But the other half of the tribe believed that, with whites already encroaching on their lands in the south, relocation was inevitable. In December, some 20 leaders, including the family of Stand Watie, signed a treaty agreeing to move to the Indian Territory.
I like to believe that they understood that the only way the Cherokee Nation would survive would be in a totally different environment, and that would be beyond the Mississippi.
Chief Ross and his followers are left behind until the Army forces them to make the move at gunpoint. A 1,000-mile march that will come to be known as the Trail of Tears. When Ross, whose wife died along with 4,000 Cherokees on the trail, finally arrived in Indian Territory, the stage is set for revenge against those who signed the treaty.
These are names that were marked for death. If I have brought my family on the Trail of Tears and I have lost loved ones and I have lost my ancestral homelands, then I now can identify those that have caused that to happen, and I am now prepared to re-evoke a millennia-old tradition of the Cherokee people called the Blood Law.
Among those marked for assassination under the Blood Law were Stand Watie and his relatives. On June 22, 1839, 3 of his family members were killed: his brother, uncle, and a cousin.
Stan Wadey would have been in that group as well, if not having been warned and escaping from his home area to go into seclusion for days.
It was then that Wadey gathered supporters of the treaty together and led a series of attacks against the Ross Party.
Those that signed were assassinated by those that didn't sign. And then those that were assassinated then took reprisals.
That tipped off a back and forth murder environment in the Cherokee Nation that went on for years. It was Bloods and Crips, and it was murder elevated to an art form.
In 1846, the U.S. took steps to halt the violence. Under the watch of peacekeeping troops in nearby Fort Gibson, the two factions were compelled to bury the hatchet. John Ross's status as principal chief was affirmed, and the Cherokees were once again one nation, but only on the surface. The Civil War will split the old wound wide open. Before the first shots are fired, when the southern states are still announcing their succession, there is pressure on the Cherokee to choose sides.
Both sides considered Indian Territory a buffer zone, Kansas to the north and Texas to the south. But it was more important to the Confederacy because they thought they would be vulnerable for an attack through Indian Territory, which is why they aggressively recruited Native Americans to fight there.
Confederate recruiters promised the Cherokee a place within the Confederate Congress and a way to continue a lifestyle that is, in many ways, Southern.
Many of the Cherokees had plantations just like you'd find in Mississippi or Alabama. They were wearing their hair long and curled at the end and were wearing gentlemen's finery. They were living the life as Southerners, many of them Southern planters, with slaves.
Slaves here in the Indian Territory had a little bit more freedom than they necessarily would in the South. They were able to carry weapons. They were able to deal with cash. They were allowed to live in their own quarters. So it wasn't exactly freedom out here, so don't get me wrong at that. It was definitely slavery, but it was a little bit more relaxed than in the general South.
The Union, by contrast, seems to give up on the Indian Territory.
At the onset of the war, Union soldiers were taken from the west. Most of the forts were closed up and they were sent east, basically to guard Washington, D.C.
The Union troops were basically sent eastward from April and May of 1861 and were to abandon Indian Territory to Confederate forces.
The move leaves John Ross, who has long enjoyed the support of the federal government, in a vulnerable position. A vulnerability that Stan Wadey is quick to exploit.
Stan Wadey, for example, he gathered up a bunch of troops to support the Confederacy even before the Confederacy had a president. So the political lines were drawn on the old treaties.
Wadey, I believe, saw the Civil War as an opportunity to set the record straight, and not so much by putting the hatchet in those that had killed his uncle and his cousins and his brother and had attempted on his life, but to set the record straight by handing the power of the government over to a group of individuals that had and was responsible for setting the course of the Cherokee people.
When the Confederates offer Wadey a commandership, he eagerly accepts. The Indian Territories are about to be torn by a civil war within a civil war.
There was a vendetta that was right under the surface, and Stan Wadey to some degree saw his chance during the Civil War to take back the Cherokee Nation.
Los Angeles is living on borrowed time.
Holy cow, this is the mother of all earthquakes sitting right under Los Angeles.
And the city is bracing for catastrophe. LA's killer quake. It is going to happen. The only question is, when? Mega Disasters, Tuesday nights at 10 on the History.
They fight their